such that they will end up not understanding exactly how to go about the next step. So you cannot achieve full security without eliminating the negative flow of cues, but also putting a positive flow of cues there such that attacker will fall prey to, and then we can predict how they're going to react to, excuse me, in the next step. And on the other side, from the human side of psychology, the psychology of humans, Virgie had about 39 studies where he tried to quantify how good humans spot deception. And he launched, he conducted these studies by college students, and he found that only 57% of college students managed to spot deception from the real information. And that is not really good. That's almost close to 50%, which is a random chance, by just saying randomly that this is deception, this is not. And what makes it matter worse is that law enforcement, the same studies has been done over law enforcement people, and they found the number dropped 3%. It became 54% of them managed to spot deception from real information.
Do you know offhand whether the law enforcement is just police or is it FBI and other?
I think they generally said law enforcement, and mostly their reference was like police and law enforcement agency. They didn't go into details whether they are specialized in deception. They just generically said law enforcement.
So this suggests it's a good idea to say, no, officer, I don't know why you pulled me over?
Probably. I think it works most of the time. So, as I said, deception-based mechanisms gives us 4 major unique advantages over traditional security mechanisms. The first one is that when you have, as we said, the negative flow of information that goes from the targeted system to the attacker, we can increase the entropy of that information. We can basically, potentially exponentially increase the number of possible paths when you try one step of an attack. So when you try to attack a system in one way, instead of saying that attack stopped, we can basically respond back by giving way more alternative to why that attack didn't succeed, and then the attacker needs to investigate way more of why such a thing didn't really work. So it increases the entropy of leaked information. The second property that deception-based mechanisms gives us is that it increases the knowledge and information that we obtain from a compromise event. So, as we said, traditional security mechanisms stop an attack when it knows about it, and that's it. It stops at this stage. But defensive-based mechanisms, when they feed these positive flow of cues to the attacker, we can monitor how they react, how they go about the next step. And that gives us richer context of information, knowing maybe we would be able to know what kind of tools they're using, because different tools would have different next step in their process. We might get more information about what their targets are, because then they will be less interested in attacking us after we give them some sort of like information that looks like what their target is. So we obtain way richer information after a compromise attempt with the deployment of deception-based mechanisms. A third interesting property is that John Boyd, who talked about the OODA loop, which is basically his idea is that for any conflict between two parties, each party goes through a cyclic process. Every time they orient they observe the response they got, they orient themselves around that response, then they decide, then they act. And he argues that the party in a conflict that executes that OODA loop faster ends up being the party who wins the conflict, which means they can observe faster, orient themselves faster, decide faster, and act faster. But when we augment deception in our systems, what we achieve is that we manage to waste their time, their resources, of things they observe, then orient themselves around, and then they decide, and then act. But all that thing they observed in the first place is not correct. And we, on the other side, we manage to observe a better response of what the things they're doing based on the things that are correct and the things that are incorrect. And we obtain more information and be able to execute that loop faster. The fourth unique advantage that deception-based mechanisms bring us is that it increases the risk of attacking the computer system. Now, when an attacker tries and attempts to attack a computer system, what happens is the response they will be getting, it's not black or white anymore. It's not either a compromise or an attack worked or it didn't work. The attack might not work, but we might make it look like it worked, and then they will be wary next time because they don't really know whether right now they're interacting with a real system or a fake system that we have in place. And that they are currently being monitored, and law enforcement are being notified and being traced, so they don't know that yet. And this is one of the unique advantages that deception-based mechanisms gives us, and I'll give one practical example of a tool that, mechanisms that we developed into how it increases the risk of attacking the computer system. Another thing that we looked at in trying to identify the role of deception is that mostly the use of deception in security defenses has been used haphazardly, where it's an ad hoc attempt to trap attackers or deter them from attacking systems, but there has been no systemization of why deception works, how does it work, and how we go about planning the deceptive operation. And this is one of the contributions of my work, is that we developed a framework into designing and integrating deception into computer security defense. And also, we noticed that many of these successful and long-standing security attacks, like Trojan horses, phishing, cross-site scripting, and what have you, they use deception as a cornerstone technique in their attacks. So phishing deceives you into believing that you're interacting with a real website. Cross-site scripting, for example, deceive you by making you not spot the thing that is really running, that script that is running in the background. Trojan horses, they deceive you by giving you a benign looking application, and then you execute it, then you end up compromising your system. All of those successfully use deception, and we argue that the use of deception in their design make the securing or defending against these attacks really hard. And that motivated us into how can we use the same coin to defend computer systems. And finally, we looked into a number of areas of computing, like human-computer interaction, human-robot interactions, and how deception has been used to make user experiences way better. We looked into the literature and gave a number of examples that how deception used in interfaces and robots designed to make the interaction with these components, computer components, better and enrich the user's experience. And so with that as a motivation to why and some of the role of deception and interesting properties, my dissertation can be summarized in this picture. So we developed a framework of using deception in security. We developed a deceptive covert channel, and we use the term channel loosely here, that basically provides a way of communication and context communication between the user and the server in authentication protocols. We developed a mechanism called ersatz password that that enhances the security of password stored in computer system, and then basically we developed a deceptive server that we basically augment internet-facing servers' responses with deception. I'm going to talk about each one of those in this presentation. So to start with the framework, we looking into the use of deception in so many conflicts, and it's as long as human, almost as a human existence, that we looked into what really make deception work and how we plan to integrate deception into security defenses. I'm not going to go at each one of these eight steps in the framework, but I'm going to highlight some of these interesting steps that I think have some contribution into the way that we use deception in computing. So one of the most important things is that when you respond back with a deceit or your system employs deception, it is very vital for the success of that operation to make such deception plausible. If the attacker will immediately be able to spot and say, no, that doesn't look right, that's not the real thing, so there's almost no value here because they would immediately know that's not true. But they need to have a response need to have some is going to believe such response because it is possible. It is something that a real system could respond with. And one of the ways that we achieve plausibility is that we look at the inclinations on the way that human beings think, or the software written by human beings, and then with these inclinations they reach some decisions that might not be completely logical or might not be the real thing, which are well documented in human decision making, which is called biases. So the role of biases is so important into designing acceptance information, and then we give some discussion of different types of biases. We have cognitive biases, organizational, cultural, personal biases, and how effective at each one of those, and we give some examples of how they have been used, and we use that framework into and showing how the different mechanisms that we develop use some sort of biases to be able to respond with deceptive responses. Another interesting part of using deception is basically how we create deceit. Yes, we first identify the bias, but then we need to create that deceitful information. And we basically provided a sort of a bigger picture where you can apply deception. So you can apply it to functionality of your system, the state of your system, and there are subcategories at each one of those where you can apply deception at. Throughout my work, I showed like when we apply deception here, we came up with that tool. And if someone takes the same problem and applies deception at a different part of the system, they might come up with a different tool. And basically, you can, when you apply deception, you can apply it to the existence, to the value, to the nature, or a combination of both of the information and the data you have, and you can manufacture that reality or create a new reality or alter so you can manufacture a reality or alter a reality or hide a reality by means of deception, or and there's like you could have a combination of these. Finally, since by design deceptive based mechanisms gives us the ability to get more information about compromise events, it is vital and important that we identify what sort of like the feedback channels that will feed back to us, such that we would know what was the response of that deceptive operation. And it's not usually your usual accept or like deny or white and black. So you have the idea that this deception is believed, and you can have some controls in place to monitor how the adversary reacts to your deception and then whether they believed it or not. Or it could be suspected. So the adversary is like not really reacting as you expect. They sort of like react partially, and then you could design your deceptive mechanisms to respond in a different manner, either with another layer of deception or pull out the deception all over and then use the traditional security mechanisms. Or it could be disbelieved, and then you go into also an interesting way of what like double deceiving, where you would put something that make them disbelieve it and then at the end believe something other alternative that you unintentionally refer to and then go about with their next steps. So it's vital to look into that and decide how does your deceptive tool or operation works. And this is like in summary that framework that we developed and used throughout the dissertation. After that, we looked into the problem of authentication, where basically you have always that challenge of when you authenticate as a user using username and password, you send your username and password all the way from the user to the server, and there is always some threats here, like man-in-the-middle threats or man-in-the-browser threats, where someone positions themselves between the browser and the server, or someone positions themselves between the interface and overlays another layer in the browser such that the user would see something different than what the server really sent. And the fundamental reason why, one of the fundamental reasons why we have these sort of threats is that there is always a information asymmetry between what the user thinks and what the server thinks when an authentication protocol is initiated. So in many cases, the user may be using some untrusted components, or in some cases the user basically is responding in response to a solicitation attempt by clicking through an email, but the server thinks the user is just coming here to authenticate. And there is no way to communicate that. And this is what motivated our design to say we want to have a contextual authentication. But also at the same time, we want anyone monitoring that authentication protocol that they cannot observe a single thing throughout that protocol. Even if they look at it, they cannot really know what sort of context is communicated. They just see some information exchanged and they have no idea what is being exchanged. And the goals that we achieve with that deceptive covert communication channel is that we limit first the password exposure. Yes, there's so many other suggestions to move away beyond passwords, but we say passwords are going to remain for at least some time, so we want to limit the exposure of passwords. We communicate, as I said, the user authentication context, and finally we incorporate that covert message between what the user think and what the user authenticating, what the context they're authenticating at, and send that all the way to the server using the same authentication channel. We don't want to create another channel there. We want to use the same authentication channel. To achieve the goals of our design, we use what is called an accumulation function. An accumulation function basically is a function that takes two variables, and then it's a one-way function that gives you an output. An accumulation function can be realized using modular exponentiation, for example. And the properties that accumulation function gives us is an accumulation, it's order independent, so accumulation of x1, x2 is equal to x2 and x1. And also this another interesting property is that you can compute the accumulation of x1 and x2 without needing to know what is x1, and the output would be equal to accumulation of x1 and x2. So you can have one of those inputs to be a previous accumulation, and you don't need to know the input to the output of the previous input. And we know that we will use H, which is the hash of the password concatenated with a salt, which is the normal way, traditional way computer systems store passwords. And we designed a protocol that I'm going to talk about some of the major milestones of that protocol. So when a user logs in, there's like a random number generated, a nonce, and then there's a key is generated based on that random number accumulation of H, and H, as I said, is the hash of the password and the salt, and R. And no one would have been able to create that key without having H, and H is dependent on the password, so no one would be able to do that without the server or the user. And then basically you create the HMAC of the AR, the salt, and the ID, and then you would send in a QR format the accumulation of Rx, which is the HMAC, the salt, and the ID is basically the server's ID. And then the user will receive that information, scan it using their phone, and there's nothing need to be stored in that phone. You store nothing in that phone, and this is one of the unique properties in our scheme that you don't store anything in that phone, so there's no sensitive information stored in that phone. And then what the user gets is that they will get the ID here shown and authenticated, because now no one would have been able to create create a valid X with the ID in it without the knowledge of the key, and the key is dependent on H. And then the user will basically verify that information by just simply typing his ID password once on the phone. They don't need to type their password in the client anymore. And then the information is verified by recomputing X. And then you can then figure out and decide whether X is valid, and then you would know that this information came from the server and it's correct, or X is not valid, and then you would notice that someone is trying to mimic the server, and then you can go about the next step. The second interesting part of that, first, now you can see we don't need to set, we can verify the identity of the server, which is an interesting property that we have. At the end here, how we incorporate the code is that basically things like the user is using a public network. So the user can tell the server that they are using a public network, which gives a dynamic authentication decision that is very interesting, or logging in as a solicitation from an email address they're using, which is common in attacks. And then basically that phone can just compute the code at one time by recreating H and then incorporating the message that it wants to send. And that is accumulation of AR. So I'm using like a weak notation here. I'm saying that you accumulate this and then you accumulate the messages. So you would have first this as an input, then you would have the messages as an input. But the idea, and you would get a code, you would, go ahead.
Who computes the first A of R?
That is sent.
That is sent. Okay,
Yeah.
but not R.
No, not R,
No,
just A of R.
is not
So
sent.
A of R,
Just A of R.
yeah.
Okay, all
It
right.
is A of R is
Okay.
sent, but not R
That's
itself.
what I thought.
Yep, and then you would get that code. The user would just simply now need to put that code. And this can be easily also integrated with a two-factor authentication where you can get that second factor as part of the accumulation component, where you can also add it to eliminate the possibility that someone is launching active man-in-the-middle attacks. And then when the code reaches the server can basically compute the possible codes based on the possible messages, and the message is basically a bitwise, like it's a bit, either a message is sent or a message is not sent, and then see if one of these codes is matched. If that code matches, then mean you know what are the specific messages that are sent, and you know that no one would have been able to create that code without the knowledge of the password that is typed on the user's phone. And then the password never sent anymore. Only one-time code that is used, and it's only one time because of the use of R, because R always generated for every authentication protocol. We compared our scheme with other schemes that try to achieve similar properties, and we noticed that some of the properties that we highlighted that we need, it's achieve all those, and some schemes basically achieve some properties or not. And one of these important properties is that we don't require phone connectivity, and there's no long-term secrets whatsoever stored in the phone. So even if you lose a phone, you don't, there's no, and also there's no need for phone enrollment. So you can use just a phone immediately without having to re-enroll that phone or store any secrets. And this just summarizes that contribution and that work that we did. After that, I'm going to move to ersatz password, which is basically a mechanism to achieve there's the threat that there could be a compromise at the server side where someone steals the list of all usernames and hash passwords. And sometimes, as we said, we don't even know that exists, and someone can log in or impersonate a number of users in our system for a long time. And this could be also available for sale in black markets, and we get different bad actors who try and have access to our computer. And that scheme is basically, before I go to that scheme, I'm going to talk about some of the motivation, why such a problem is very widespread, and because we have seen very high profile incidents. So for example, Evernote lost 50 or had a compromised event where someone stole a 50 million user account of username and the hash passwords, and it has been, some of those has been cracked offline. Similar attacks happen for Yahoo, RockU, eHarmony, LinkedIn, and other companies. And as shown by the New York Times newspaper, this is usually used as a precursor to gain advantage to our system, and that takes, for example, in the New York Times incident, someone has been gaining access to their internal system for a period of 4 months without anyone detecting it, because they were using the correct username and password they obtained from a black market, and was cracked and gained access to that system. ersatz password achieve 3 main goals. The first one is it's completely eliminating the possibility of anyone being able to offline crack a username and hash password file. So we achieve that by use of a hardware-dependent function, such that when to be able to crack something, you need to recompute the hash of your input in a dictionary and then see whether it matches what you have in the file. So with the use of a hardware-dependent function like an HSM, like a puff, something of that nature, no one can recompute that value without having physical access to that machine. There has been similar schemes suggested in the literature that uses some interesting hardware-dependent functions, but none of them, I have never seen some of them really implemented, and this is one of the things that we implemented this component. These has been theoretically suggested to use such mechanisms. But the more important feature is what we do is that when we compute the hardware-dependent function of the input being the password, we basically inject the seed in the same format of the etc shadow file, for example. Like that's an example of the etc shadow file. So the format would be the same, but what is stored here is different than what is stored here, even though they're using the same password. And when someone tries to crack this and run it through tools like John the Ripper or something like that, the password they will get back is a password that we intentionally injected in this step. And it's the same file. And this is the same thing that a system uses to verify whether our password is correct by means of using the hardware-dependent function. So instantaneously, you can make these all go and become hardware-dependent and inject deceit in them. And someone compromises your system later, you can, when they crack the ersatz password here, when they attempt running John the Ripper over this one, they would get an ersatz password, and then when they log in, as I'm going to talk later, you can detect that someone is using the ersatz password that you specifically injected. So it means they stole your file, they attempted to crack it, and at the end they're trying to log in using this new password. There's two generic steps in the way that we implement our scheme. The first one is that traditional operating systems at least store the password in a couple of information. So they have the username, they have alpha, and alpha is basically the hash of the password and the salt, and then they store the salt publicly. So the first step in our protocol is that we instantaneously compute hardware-dependent function over alpha, and then recompute the hash again here with the same salt. And so instead of the password here, we do the HDF of complete alpha, and then we have beta here. Beta has the same format because we're using the same hash function here, and then you would end up having the username, beta, and the salt. So the idea here, if someone obtaining beta, they cannot verify whether a password is what is stored in beta because they don't have access to the hardware-dependent function. So they cannot crack. And the second step where we inject the deceit is when the user logs in, the user provides his username and password. So we take that and then we choose an ersatz password. An ersatz password does not need to be related to the password at all. So it could be selected at random, it could be selected from a file, and we talk about a number of different generation algorithms that we use to create the ersatz password. And then basically what you would compute is, you would compute the hardware-dependent function of the real password, concatenate it with the username, and XOR that with the ersatz password, and then that will give you your new salt. You take your new salt, and then basically store this. Your new beta prime here would be the hash of the ersatz password concatenated with the salt, which applies to the same format that we talked about here. But you note that P star here, which is the ersatz password, is computed by hardware-dependent function of PI concatenated with UI and XORed with the salt. So you compute that, and this gives you your P star, and then you concatenate that with the salt, you hash it, and then now you have two things different. You have your new beta prime, and then you have a new salt. And then you store those. So what happens when you want to check an authentication request? So the user comes, give username and password. So first you apply hardware-dependent function on the password, concatenate it with the username, XOR that with the salt, then concatenate that with the salt, and then see if this is equal, you stored beta, that the user, beta prime, the new beta that you have. If this is equal, that means it is a correct login. And then the user will be just logged in. Using the same entry to check whether it's an ersatz password, you basically just compute the hash of the P concatenated with the salt and see if that equals your beta prime, that means an ersatz password has been used to log in. And when that happens, you can basically trigger an internal alarm saying, there's two things that you're sure that happened. First, someone managed to compromise your computer, obtained the list of hashed username and hash password, attempted to crack it, then got the ersatz password, and they are trying to log in using that ersatz password. comes with a very high probability. And then the second thing, you can trigger an alarm to say, based on the policy that you have in place, what do you want to do next? Do you want to just reject it and then counts, and then that's just completely policy dependent. But what is happening here, you are proactively reacting to these compromised events instead of what we have in the current state that we really don't know until 5% of the time our tool is detected, or 95% of the time we either external parties notify us or something of that nature happen. And if, going back to the third step, if none of these really match, it means that it's an incorrect username and password. And as I said, that gives us these three main properties. Now, no one can do an offline attack. And even if someone inside and trying to do an attack have access to the HSM, they need to extensively use that hardware-dependent function. And then you can also set up policy in place by saying, no one can query a certain username more than 5 consecutive times, and then you need to lock the user account, as you do in protecting any online cracking attempts. Or you can throttle the response by having interesting, like exponential throttling of the requests, or whatever you want to enforce as per to your policy. And as I said, there is the capability of triggering an internal alarm and detecting compromised events before any bad thing happens. And then the third and important thing is that we maintain exactly the same format of the Etsy shadow file, for example, storing the username and password. So someone obtaining that in the black market, or compromising your system and then gathering everything and getting out, they really have no way, no distinguisher to know whether you're using your SATS password or not. So there's no way for them to be able to decide what to do next. And that's exactly go back to the point that deception-based mechanisms gives us, is increases the risk of attacking your system. Now when someone gets a password back, they don't know if they're getting the real password or an ersatz password. So that's an interesting property that we get from ersatz password. We talk about a number of different properties that we needed in ersatz password. So they need to be, as I said, to be plausible. So this will look like a real password. It applies to the policy that the organization set in place. Like, for example, an organization says it needs to be at least 8 characters, a mixture of upper and lowercase characters and a symbol. That ersatz password need to adhere to the same policy. Also, it needs to be non-deducible. So what that means is that from the ersatz password itself, if someone knows they're using ersatz password scheme, they cannot go back to the real password. So if you use a generation algorithm that just creates an ersatz password from a predetermined list that you create, you don't run into that problem. But if you are using, as part of the generation functions that we discussed and give the pros and cons of each one of them in the dissertation, if you generate the ersatz out of the real password, you need to have some sort of assurances that someone getting the ersatz password, they cannot go back and deduce what is the real password is, or some properties of the real password. And it needs to be type resilient, and that's also important, that the user cannot mistype his own password and move to the ersatz password and then false positive get triggered, something bad happened. And you can also get that sort of assurance by measuring the distance between your ersatz password and the real password. You would say, what is the edit distance between the real password and the ersatz password? How many typos that a human needs to make to be able to move here? And most of the studies say if you have a typo of 5 or more, they're in the range of 3 to 5. The user is very unlikely to mistype something and their real password and move to the ersatz password. And as I said, they need to be crackable, and crackability is also an interesting feature that if all your passwords become ersatz and get cracked, the attacker might suspect that you're using ersatz. So you need to mimic also like the overall plausibility of the whole file. So in many of the studies that studied real existing leaked databases of file, they noticed there's between 20 and 50% of passwords did not crack using the generic tools and the most advanced tools, which mean they are strong passwords, they almost appear random, they are not dictionary passwords that are being cracked. We implemented this using a UBHSM, and our hardware dependent function was an XMAX shell one with a key stored in the HSM. So you would give it the input and it would give you the output back. So no one can, and it has resistance, tamper resistance for the key, such that if someone tries to extract that key, it will destroy that key and everything. And also we talk about what happens in terms of backup mechanism. And the dissertation, how can you, if the hardware dependent function fails, what you need to do, what's sort of like the backup mechanism in your system such that you don't completely lose everything. So we give a detailed backup mechanism there. And then we implemented this by modifying an OpenBSD operating system, and then modified the PAM Unix pluggable authentication module there to use ersatz password, and it just works seamlessly. We just modify it once, we recompile the operating system, and the operating system works just fine, and then we have the etc master.password file in OpenBSD having that ersatz password, and we attempted to crack that file, and then we got the ersatz password back. There has been a noticeable performance hit when using ersatz password, and we investigate that further. So we can see here it takes about 12, on average 10 milliseconds, I would say, to authenticate or replace, update a password, but it takes about 300 milliseconds in ersatz password scheme. And this was mainly due to the library that we used and the type of HSM that we used. So it was plugged through a USB, so there was like IO operation, and the API that they provided was a Python, and PAM Unix is in C, so we need to have a Python wrapper and call to C, and then C called the Python interpreter, execute things, and get back to us. So there is a noticeable hit in performance. My colleague Chris Gutierrez had a significant role into implementing that and doing some of the tests. And that finally leads me to the final component of my thesis, which we call Deceptiver, which is a deceptive server that its goal is to secure internet, it's augment internet-facing applications with deceptive responses. So why internet-facing applications? Because, as I said, going back to the Verizon DBIR report, in 2013, 35% of the attacks in 2013 were web application attacks. So more than 1/3 of the attacks, all the attacks in 2013 was a result of someone getting or compromising a web application. And also Gartner states that more than 70% of the threats the organization face is at the web application layer. So we thought it might be interesting to devise a solution to secure and augment deceptive responses at the web application. So this is the overall design of Deceptiver. So basically it's a deceptive server that stays back at the back end, and then it hooks to your internet-facing application. So it can hook to HTTP, FTP, SSH, SMTP, and POP3, and all these servers, and then augment their responses with deceptive responses. And the idea is you can respond back with ways other than your traditional allow or deny the request. So one of the most interesting questions is, what is different in Deceptiver that is not being done in honeypots? I think there are three major differences. The first one is that Deceptiver is basically instantaneously reflects the current state, current production state of your system. Mostly honeypot, it's either a system that an attacker needs to interact with, or you need to continuously update it. So here in Deceptiver, if a resource does not have a rule to protect it, it's automatically reflected in the Deceptiver response. So if an attacker is advanced and they have a cooperating insider at SMTP and say, okay, when you receive a request or you receive an email from an email that I just created right now, that email, no one would have been able to send something to that email except for this specific blacklisted data harvesting bot. And now we can do whatever we want. We can discard that email, we can forward it to FireEyes or virtual machines to study its content, and that can significantly help in a situation like spear phishing or things like that. We implemented that server in the back end, and we implemented a hook to the Apache server, and basically intercepts all requests that come through Apache, and decide what to send it to Deceptiver, decide what to do, and then send a request back. And this was like the design decision. We could have implemented Deceptiver as a proxy server, but that was like the initial design decision that we thought that might be interesting. And then we started running some interesting tests to see what sort of like performance impact Deceptiver would have. And our hypothesis that it would have some performance effect, and it did, and it had a significant one. So we implemented the hook inside Apache using a mod security module, and we then ran Apache without mod security, with mod security without, with only the default rules, mod security with a CRS, which is a set of security rules created by OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, and then we had mod security with our Deceptiver rules. And then what happened, we noticed a huge impact on that, and we said, all right, we want to investigate further. That doesn't look good. These numbers are milliseconds, and these are the number of requests. So if we send 10 requests, like with all the rules set by WASP, it takes 0.4 milliseconds to get a response. But with Deceptiver in place, it takes 258 seconds on average to get a response. And that is not good. We want to investigate what is the reason behind that and how we can improve that. We noticed that 9 lines of the codes inside Deceptiver accounts for 99.2% of the time. So that means these line codes are the bottlenecks, and then we need to figure out, and all of these 99 codes, we're basically making an SQL call to the SQL server. We're using MySQL with mostly default configuration and some indexes in place for the mostly common things that we query on. And then we noticed that there are a couple of things that we can improve, and we talked about it in this presentation. One of them is that some requests that are sent from Deceptiver to SQL is basically just to maintain the context, to say that's what happened, that's who accessed, and that's the decision. One thing that we can do to eliminate all of that, to make this call to SQL and saving that information to be asynchronous, that we don't need to wait until the information is updated to respond back. And there's like a number of things that we can also improve in making the performance with MySQL connection better. So with that, I conclude the contribution of my thesis with the framework. So that was the contribution of my thesis was the discussing the role of deception and how deception fits, and developing a framework and developing 3 different deceptive tools. And then I talked about a number of possible areas of future research. One of that is further investigating the role of biases, either in responding deceptively, but also securing computer users. When we understand the biases that that attacks that use deceptive elements in their design, for example, if we can better understand what phishing attacks deceptive elements, like whether it's a sense of urgency or fear of loss or things like that, and we understand these biases, we can respond with a better warning messages and better alter the user behavior to enhance their security. Also, modeling the use of deception, we are doing right now with Chris Gutierrez heading the work on that, and modeling deception using game theoretic models like hyper games, and there are some interesting results, but also using some existing models like attack trees or cyber kill chains, and how does deception really fits. Can we incorporate, for example, biases and perception into the modeling of attack trees, and how would that change the way that we model attack trees and the paths that different attackers can take? A third area of future research is studying the economical and ethical issues around the use of deception. whether it's an externality effect, which, for example, is achieved in our ersatz password scheme, that since the password file looks the same, if only a small number of users use or employ, or a small number of organizations employ employ ersatz password, and then anyone later obtaining a password file from a black market, they basically cannot get and cannot know exactly whether ersatz has been used or not. That significantly enhance the security of or alter the markets, the black markets interactions. Fourth area of future research is studying further metrics when we use deception. So we talked about plausibility, deducibility, and confusion, and how can we measure those? How can we measure the plausibility aspect? We gave some cryptographic games in our ersatz password scheme, and how we want or how we formally define plausibility, but it's an area of interesting further research. Before final area is that how can we create deceits? We gave some examples of ideas on how to create deceits in a framework, but it would be an area of further interest, and it relates again to plausibility and how can you create deceit that is also plausible. And finally, developing some more advanced tools that use deception, like a deceptive patching mechanism, that, for example, when you patch something, you can still make it look like it did not have been patched, and that would help you, for example, to obtain the exploits that are used and things like that, deceptive file system, deceptive system calls, where if you notice that someone is trying to reach the limit of their permissions, continuously someone trying to poke around, how can you augment deception as system calls, such that sometimes you would return deception and return deceptive information and monitor the response. And with that, I just give an overview of some of the top publications that papers that we published, talk about this work, and does that conclude my presentation, and thank you so much for your time.
Members of the committee, questions?
Sure.
In the model, which you were saying, actually in the framework, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You are essentially, it seems to me, pretty much assuming consistency of the deception. In other words, you're putting up a false image. Now, what would have to change within the model so that you could deal with inconsistent deception, where, as you point out in your thesis, the goal is basically to confuse the heck out of the adversary so that they'll go away and leave you alone. Do you think the model would require much, or the framework would require extensive changes?
So I talked a little bit about consistency and deception in my dissertation. I didn't touch on it here. I had it in some backup slides, but the idea is we don't need to change the model, because the model at the beginning starts with identifying the strategic goal of deception. What do you want to achieve? So if you want to achieve that an attacker needs to believe what you're sending, basically you need to have consistent deception. But if you want to achieve levels of confusion at the attacker side, you can basically have some sort of inconsistent deception. And that can also be captured in the monitoring aspect, where when you can augment some places where, say, if it's believed next time, feeding back to the model, send something different. And if it's suspected, that's exactly our goal. That's what we want them to suspect it, and then we're going to send them with a different version. So the model captures that, but I didn't extensively talk about it in explaining the model, but I gave a subsection talking about deception and consistency, and referring to the work that also you did, and saying uncertainty, deception doesn't necessarily need to have uncertainty. And we also, in the adopted definition of deception, we changed it to capture consistency, because it did not have confusion in it. And the ultimate goal of inconsistency is to cause confusion. You don't want to give a one or a portrait and a one picture of your system. We want them to confuse them, and being inconsistent on a number of and argue that a definition doesn't capture the inconsistency of deception, which is also valid if that's your goal. and then we gave some sort of discussion and dissertation. I didn't talk about it here, but that's a great point. Thanks.
There were a few paragraphs in there which were quite good. Following up on that, the deceptiver, sorry, I keep wanting to say
No worries.
deceptiver.
Deceptive server.
Okay, the deceptive server, that focuses on network deception essentially, correct?
So it focuses on the internet-facing servers that you have.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, do you have any thoughts on how you would augment that or modify it so that it could also focus on host-based deception?
I did not really give it a lot of thought. It's definitely something interesting. The challenge would be to, so the challenge would be at what layer in the host that you need to have that hook. So the idea is that since the design of the deceptor server is that the decision, there's two major components. There's the decision making and there's the hooks. So if we manage to find a place, maybe at the system call, or if we're dealing with virtual machines and put it at the hypervisor level, we can use the same thing with the rules that we have and use the same decision making by plugging it, by just creating a hook for it. So it can be extensible to a host base, but I didn't investigate that.
Okay, taking that one more step further, do you know how many ways there are to get the current working directory in Linux?
How many ways what?
To get the current working directory in Linux, and you're saying, oh, it's quite a jump.
I'm not sure I'm getting your
Current
question.
working directory.
Current working directory, yeah.
Do you know how many ways there are to get that?
No.
Okay, turns out there are at least 3. So the interesting question there, in addition to what you said, there's a question of where do you put the hooks, which you point out, but you may have to put 3 or 4 hooks in there to gather the same information. So that's a little trick that.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be definitely trickier because it assumes that the hook that you put everything that needs to go through it, and that can be easily guaranteed, much easier to be guaranteed in servers because you can just hook it there, but it would be a harder thing to do in host-based applications, unless, for example, you do it at a hypervisor level, where everything needs to go through the hypervisor, right? But exactly as you said, when going through, putting in, and you need sometimes maybe multiple hooks to guarantee that, and it would be very hard to enumerate all the possible ways. But I think that would be an interesting thing to happen that we might further investigate that will give us some sort of like an inconsistent deception, because when you have a hook here, it will give that response. When you don't have a hook, it will give a different response. And if you may manage to make the place where the hook is given plausible enough to be confused or inconsistent and not like there's no certainty which one of them is correct, you can achieve inconsistency without having to augment every possible path. So that would be some interesting thing to investigate, but